Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Joseph. Hello and welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us today for the first of 4 webinars in Marco's Microplastics webinar series. We're so glad you could be here. My name is Avalon Bristow, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, or MARCO, which is a regional ocean partnership covering the states of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. Today's webinar focuses on microfibers, which is a growing concern in the marine debris field. It's brought to you by Marco's Marine Debris Work Group, which is made up of state and federal agencies, as well as NGO partners and mission-focused for-profit entities. Together, we form this work group with a shared goal, which is to bring together regional stakeholders to collectively identify, understand, prevent, and mitigate the impacts of marine debris. Microfibers are the most prevalent type of microplastic found in the environment, and researchers have detected them in marine wildlife, ocean habitats, and in seafood. But there's still a lot we don't know about microfibers. For example, what are the environmental impacts, and how can microfibers be most effectively prevented or mitigated in the marine environment? During this webinar, we will highlight the work being done by professionals in the Mid-Atlantic region to develop innovative solutions for understanding, quantifying, and tackling the issues of microfibers. We'll then have a facilitated discussion and question and answer session where we encourage all of you to ask presenters questions about their work and explore how regional partnerships can advance efforts to prevent and reduce microfibers in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to the Marine Debris Work Group and the Marco staff that put a lot of time and thought into creating this webinar series, and also to the speakers that we have in attendance with us today. I'm thrilled to introduce all of you to Joseph Barnes, Marco's first Microplastics Fellow, who will go over some housekeeping items before introducing today's speaker. And again, thank you for being here with us. Go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you, Avalon. And thank you, everyone, for attending. As Avalon said, I am Marco's Marine Debris Microplastics Fellow, and I have the pleasure of coordinating these webinars. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to run through some Zoom logistics. We are recording this webinar, and we'll post it to the Marco website afterward. Please keep yourself muted during the webinar. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers following the facilitated discussion portion of the webinar. So please submit your questions in the chat box in the bottom tab of the Zoom window, and I'll be monitoring the chat box to collect those questions throughout the webinar. This is all about offering collaborative opportunities, so feel free to put your name, organization, and where you're tuning in from in the chat so we can make those connections. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. They will each have about 10 minutes for their respective topics, and then we'll have a facilitated discussion followed by questions from the audience in the chat box. First, we have Catherine Prunella, the Water Quality Extension Specialist with New York Sea Grant. Catherine connects New Yorkers with cutting-edge research on water pollution, currently partnering with researchers at Columbia University on innovative technology that filters and removes plastic, including microplastics, from waterways. Then we'll have Dr. Gangadhar Andaluri, Assistant Professor within the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Temple University. His research experiences span a wide array of fields encompassing water and wastewater treatments, computational quantum chemistry, microplastics, and other emerging contaminants, to name a few. Our third speaker had a last-minute schedule change and is unable to join us, but you can learn more about the Interagency Marine Debris Coordinating Committee's report on microfiber pollution from the EPA Trash Free Waters Program webinar. I'll put a link to that webinar in the chat for you to view later if you're interested. Following the presentations, our moderator, Will Eisenberg, will facilitate a discussion with our speakers. After that, we'll open the floor for audience Q&A, giving you the opportunity to engage with our speakers. Will is a coastal planner in the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program, and he is the state co-lead of the Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Work Group. So thank you all again for being here, and I'll pass it off to Catherine Prunella.
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Joseph. Let me just share my slides. Can you see my slide deck?
Yes, we can.
And you see it the right way, right? Not with the notes.
Yes,
Okay, last step, laser pointer. Okay, hello
there it is.
everybody. My name is Prunella. I am a water quality extension specialist with New York Sea Grant. Today I'm going to be talking to you about community engagement around microfiber pollution. Before I start, I've given this presentation a few times. I like to do what I call a grounding exercise. So I invite everybody to take a couple of seconds. Think about the shirt that you're wearing, maybe feel it on your skin, take a look at it. And I invite you to guess, what is your shirt made out of? Or maybe check your clothing tag. I think most of our cameras are off, so it's safe to kind of play around with it. Take a couple of seconds, check with your clothing, what your shirt in particular is made out of. If you want, feel free to drop the fabric material in the chat. I'll wait until I see something pop up in the chat before I proceed. Polyester, starting right off. Yeah, so I see some polyester. Maybe perhaps people are wearing, all right, we saw cotton. Oh, modal, spandex. Yeah, cool. Reclaimed waste cotton. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you guys for participating. Yeah, so just starting off, just a couple of introductory slides. I'm sure you know this to some extent, but our clothing is often described as being either a natural textile or a synthetic textile. Natural textiles refer to plant-based or animal hair-based items like cotton, hemp, linen, wool, silk, and then quote unquote synthetic textiles or synthetic fibers refer to polyester, nylon, acrylic, spandex. And if you could look to this on this table, the column to the far right, the total percent of textile production, this is from I think 2020, you can see that polyester makes up the dominant source of textile. It's the dominant type of textiles that are being manufactured. So more and more of our clothing is being made from synthetic materials like polyester, which doesn't readily break down in the environment. And so the process of microfiber pollution, we do laundry, we throw perhaps our polyester shirt in the washing machine, we add the detergent, we add the hot water, it gets all churned up and it gets abraded, and then tiny pieces of threads or fibers, so we're going to call them microfibers throughout this presentation. We're referring to these tiny broken up pieces of fabric go into our water. Now, I'm in New York City, so we have a wastewater treatment system. Most of the fibers pass through wastewater treatment facilities and go into the solid sludge product. In New York City, that's mostly incinerated, but also it could be used for agriculture. But because these fibers can be so small, the other thing, we're talking about microfibers, but this includes nanofibers, so really, really tiny materials. These can pass through wastewater treatment facilities and go directly into our water. And then our dryer vents out microfibers, and studies of microfiber present and microplastic presence in humans often focus on inhalation as a source of microfibers getting into our bodies. So one of the ways that microfibers will go into the atmosphere is via our washing dryers. So the reason I'm talking about laundry is because I'm part of a grant that was funded through the NOAA Sea Grant Marine Debris Challenge with Columbia University, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where researchers, engineers, filtration experts at both Columbia and Stony Brook on Long Island are working on developing a filtration system for washing machines and dryers that collect and capture microfibers before they leak into the environment. And then we're working with a textile scientist at North Carolina State University on how to take those filtered microfibers and repurpose them or reuse them. I'm not going to talk too much about the science here because that's not my focus. My focus is on community engagement, but I figured I would show you these kind of big confusing figures. So this is a model of what the technology is going to the system. Here are some actual photos of like a deconstructed washing machine with all these pipes going through and testing all the factors that lead to microfiber shedding and then testing different filters. Again, this isn't my focus of this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about community engagement, but I just wanted to show you that this is some of the research that's happening at Columbia University. So, talking about, first off, I'm in New York City and a lot of us live in apartments, and so a lot of us go to laundromats. And so I did this kind of weird thing where I went to some laundromats around the city and I talked to people about microfibers. I had semi-structured interviews that were recorded where I asked them questions like, do you know what microfibers are? Do you know what microplastics are? What do you think about when you buy clothing? Do you ever look at the clothing tag? And so here's just some snapshots of the results. Most of the folks I talked to had, if they indicated that they had heard of the word microfiber, they associated it with a type of cleaning cloth or a type of upholstery. So this is because, textile industries use the word microfibers for certain types of products, right? And maybe show of hands, has anybody here heard of a microfiber cleaning cloth? Or yeah, I see some hands, right? Or like a camping cloth, right? So that's immediately just something to consider when we are communicating about this issue is that when you say the word microfiber, folks might have a pre-existing notion of this being a product, right? But a lot of people didn't know about microplastics. So most of the people, 8 of the people I spoke to had heard of microplastic pollution. They might have not heard of microfiber pollution, but they knew about microplastic pollution. And this is consistent with this figure I'm showing here. This is a time series this is from Google Trends. So how often the word microplastic has been Googled. This is just my kind of quick and dirty way of seeing what the timeline is of people thinking about the microplastic issue. And you can see that over the last 4 or 3 years or so since 2021, there has been a lot more Googling of the word microplastic. And if you take that as an indicator of interest, there's a lot more people. This is very much a contaminant of emerging concern. So going back to the conversations I was having in laundromats, another point that I found interesting was that most of the people, 8 of the people I spoke to, don't really consider the clothing tag when they buy their clothes. They expressed fit and look. A bunch of people said, I don't want to buy anything I have to take to a dry cleaner, but only a few people spoke about what the material is actually made out of. 3 of the people that talked about certain types of fabrics that they look for are runners and bikers and hikers who are thinking about technical fabrics like down or polyester or wool. So things that you can use for outdoor activities, right? Polyester is a fantastic material when it comes to like taking your sweat off. And down is insulating. So I'm referring to synthetic down. So a few people thought about fabric when it came to this technical. And then even though people reported that they didn't really think about fabric when they bought clothes, I still heard from half of the folks that there was this preference for natural fibers. Somebody talked about how they only put their baby in cotton because they think it's better for the skin, right? So there was this kind of idea that maybe cotton is better. And then almost all of them, when we talked about, I asked them questions like, do you ever think about where the water goes when it leaves your washing machine? Everyone was like, well, now that you mention it, yeah, okay. But no one had ever thought about that as being an issue prior to our conversation. This is a study that was done in Belgium, a much larger and more robust study where they interviewed they sent out questionnaires to over 400 people. And it confirms the results that I had in my small study. 68% of the people they spoke to had heard about or knew about microplastic pollution, but only 37% knew about microfiber pollution. So we know about microplastics. We aren't exactly making the connection between like our clothing being a source of microplastic pollution. And then this study also asked folks, what were the factors you would consider when buying a filter? Like if you were to buy a filter for your washing machine, what would drive you to make that purchase? And the number one things were price, right? It has to be affordable. And then usability and convenience. So let's say you buy a filtration system for your washing machine, but you don't actually have any access to the pipes, or you don't understand, you wouldn't know how to install it. That would be a major deterrent to actually purchasing that filter and installing it. And then the last point here that I found really interesting, and that's going to segue into the next couple of slides, is that In this study, they gave a handful of folks an actual laundry filter. It's called a Guppy Friend. It's a bag that's available. And they asked folks to report on what their experience was using it. A bunch of people said, oh, well, I didn't see any microfibers. I didn't see anything come out. And so that was kind of unremarkable and it demotivated my use of the product. I want to see that it works. And that was also something I heard when I was doing the interviews. I was told by at least one person, oh, I use a Brita filter for my water, but I have no idea if it works. It just kind of feels right to use, right? And so that's kind of the crux of community engagement around microfiber pollution, is that this is very much an invisible issue. It's you have to find a way to show people what they can't see, which are these microfibers. And so I'm just going to provide I think 2 or 3 examples of some of the education methods that people have done to try to show microfibers. This is a method that's come out from the Rosalia Project. They call it CSI for the ocean. If you're interested in doing any sort of education around microfibers, I encourage you to check out their website. This is a fantastic resource. Their protocol is kind of complicated though. There's a bunch of steps. They take a metal bucket, right? Because everything has to be metal or glass, because if you use plastic materials, you might be introducing plastic into your sample. So they use a metal bucket and then they use glass mason jars and a ceramic filter. And then they take some Scotch tape or just any tape and they put it against the filter. And then they put that slide underneath a microscope. And so for this, it's the microscope that's illuminating these microfibers, but they have a portal, they have a way for you to submit data. So it feels like it's ramping up to be this larger citizen science project. I was doing a quick scan of the audience. I saw that Michaela was here from the Hudson River Park Trust, which is a New York City organization. I don't have a slide on it, so I'm just going to talk about it. Michaela, maybe you can comment on this in the comments or the Q&A, but they had a project for their students during COVID when the students were home, where they took a laundry bag, like something that you would usually put your delicates in, and they washed the clothing in the laundry bag, and then they took a little hands microscope, I think a relatively affordable one, and they looked at the microfibers in that bag. So these are kind of examples of how if you have some sort of microscopy, you can show people the microfibers. I've done a different system with a material called Nile Red, which is a lipid stainer. So Nile Red will preferentially, under UV light, will fluoresce plastics. It's really hard to see in these photos, but what I do is take a coffee filter. I pour a water sample through the coffee filter. I apply a little bit of this Nile Red, and then you might be able to see it if you squint. This is from my iPhone camera, so the photos aren't very good, but there is this kind of day glow color around the microplastics. Now, this won't tell you whether or not it's a microplastic or a microfiber, but it's just a way to kind of see materials with your naked eye. This is from a study where they have a much better photo of what Nile Red does when it gets applied to a microplastic. So this is an example of like, I will put a little bit of Nile Red and then I'll show people and they see the day glow color of the fibers and they get really excited. I think this is my last slide. This is about the messaging I give, because when you describe an environmental problem, an environmental contaminant to somebody, you say, hey, did you know that your environment is filled with microfibers? When you look at your dust under a microscope, it's all these fibers. People are like, well, what can I do about that? How can I prevent that? And it's a really tough question to answer. This is pulled from a flyer that I posted online. I could add it to the chat. So the way I do this, and I'll take any feedback, is I say, oh, well, there's some things you can do to reduce your microfiber pollution that will also help you keep your clothing for longer. Because microfiber pollution is basically just your clothes breaking down, right? If you see holes form in your shirt after you wash it, it's because some of your clothes broke down and went into our environments. So you can do things like washing your clothes less. Try it. Try re-wearing some things. Try spot treating instead of throwing the entire thing in the washer. You can try air drying your clothes. Instead of throwing them in the dryer, maybe hang them up along a dryer pin. You can try washing them in colder water. And then I encourage folks to check clothing tags and start thinking, I try not to tell anybody to change their purchasing decisions, but start to think about the fact that your clothes might have plastic in them. And if you can, maybe avoid buying that polyester fleece if you already have a few. Maybe you don't need another one. That's kind of the underlying message that isn't particular to microfiber pollution, but is basically within the sustainability in textiles messaging is just buy less clothing, this kind of anti-consumption message. But if you are buying, maybe consider the fact that if you buy a 100% polyester shirt, it's going to be here forever. It's going to shed into the environment. And then there's also there are existing filtration systems that can be considered for purchase. There's things like the Cora ball, which you don't throw it, you place it inside the washing machine. There's things like the Guppy Friend, which you can put your clothes in, it's a bag and you put it, and then there's actual inline devices that you can install. I say you can consider buying these. But if you don't want to buy them now, maybe consider a future where they're already built in. The same way you buy your car and it already has the catalytic converter, maybe one day you will buy a washing machine and it will already have a filter inside of it. For that to happen, though, there might need to be policy push. That's my last slide. I'm here for the Q&A, and I encourage you to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I already learned so much. That was awesome. Next, please welcome Dr. Gangadhar Andaluri for our next presentation.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's all
Yes.
done.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction, and also thank you, Catherine, for some of the information which makes my talk a little easier why we are seeing fibers. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gangadhar Andaluri. I'm a faculty in the Civil and Environmental Engineering at Temple University, and my research is mostly focused on understanding emerging contaminants, including microplastics and their distribution in our rivers. So this study that I'll be presenting is something we did it right. We started right before COVID, and we did it through 2019 and 2020, where we looked for, what types of microplastics are present in the Delaware River. And as some of you might know, microplastics are synthetic polymers which are less than 5 millimeters in size, and they could be coming from cosmetics, cleaning agents, or they could be decomposing from bigger plastic material when they are exposed to sunlight and physical wear and all those kind of things. And here in this picture on the top, you can actually see one of the microfibers that caught in our nets. It's a 60 times zoomed picture on a 90 micron size net. So it's a very tiny, tiny microfiber that we have zoomed out. And these microplastics, we can actually categorize them based on their shape, size, what's their colors, composition, and how much of the distribution is there. And the picture below is showing a DRBs. So this project we work with the Delaware River Basin Commission, and we have deployed some nets as well as did some grab sampling where we just dipped in like glass bottles and collected like almost 10 liters of samples. So different types of sampling that we did. And most of you might know Delaware River stretches almost 280 miles all the way from New York down to Delaware Bay. And it's a critical water source for over 15 million people. And it supports fishing, tourism, and all of those. And it has some tributaries, and it supports a very diverse ecosystem. So our idea was to understand in the upper Delaware estuary, like if there are any microplastics. So we did our sampling all the way from Trenton down to Delaware Bay, and this picture is actually essentially showing where we have collected our samples from. So we collected like 14 distinct locations, and we used both net and grab sampling. And once we got the samples, we passed them through some sieves, and we did some chemical digestion, and we collected those particles that were stuck, and each and every particle that we were able to get, we did something called a Fourier FTIR analysis, where the instrument is going to tell us what type of microplastic it is. So we did that, and I will go into some of the data or results that we saw. So essentially, this picture here is showing us like uh, the distribution of microplastics in terms of the shape. And this is very important, as you can see in almost all the locations that we sampled. So these top ones are grab samples, and these bottom ones are net samples. So net samples are nothing but we deployed the net for almost 4 hours and collected what air is stuck on those nets. So those nets were around 154 microns in size. So some plastics might have slipped through that, but whatever we were able to collect, we could collect, and did our analysis. And as you can see, both and also we collected samples from the surface and also from the bottom of some of the locations in the rivers. And as we can see that most of the particles that we were detecting were fibers. And as you heard Catherine talk about fibers coming from clothing or wastewater, that kind of tells us the story. Okay, there is so many people, we are washing our clothes, our wastewater is entering our wastewater treatment plants, and they could be escaping because those waters are released into the rivers. And also you can see all different shapes here. There were like bundles of fibers, there were like films, like right here, there were fragments, there were spherical particles, and again, each one of them can come from a different source. Uh, this grab samples, pretty much we have been seeing fibers. Net samples, there was like a little bit uniform distribution of these fibers. And after that, we looked into their size. So we passed this water through a couple of different sieves, essentially going from 100 microns, 500 microns, 250 microns, and 90 microns. So we can see like what is the distribution of their size. So and for our grab samples, almost 70% of the particles were below the 500 micron range, which is on the lower side of the microplastics, whereas most of the particles on our net were actually greater than 500 microns, and that could be mostly because of we used 153 micron mesh, and some of these lower sized particles might have escaped, and whatever was stuck with leaves and debris and all those, they were catching like particles that were on the larger size. And then we also looked at what all different colors of microplastics we have seen. So this picture is showing a distribution of all different colors of microplastics. And again, these colors could be, if it's clothing, if the fibers are coming from clothing, we have all different types of clothes that we wear. And if it is plastic bottles, like some degradation, or it could be any type of plastics that were discarded and they were turning into microplastics. We can see a wide variety of colors here. Black, blue, brown, clear was mostly a lot of particles were on the clear side. There were like all different colors that we have seen. And one of the important aspect in terms of these microplastics and microfibers is to understand what is their composition. And so in our experiments, when we collected our samples, not only did we look at what is their size, what colors they are, how much concentration. Concentration is, I would say, in this context, it's more of a term where we are saying like so much concentration per liter, but that may not be the perfect number because we did some grab sampling, which is we just collected the sample at one time. But if we need to know a perfect composition, we might have to continuously collect samples for for a longer time. But what we have seen in our sample collection was most of the samples that were collected using nets. They were predominantly composed of polyester, polypropylene, polyethylene fibers, and or plastics, and many of them were actually the fibrous material. So you can see that polyester is predominantly used in clothing, and it could be coming from washing machines or wastewater plants or whatever. And for our grab samples as well, most of the materials that we saw were polyester and rayon. Rayon is again a type of rayon is kind of like a type of like semi-synthetic fabric material. So essentially, it's telling us like there is a lot of these tiny, tiny fibers that are coming out. Uh, which are like pretty much fibrous materials. And not only those, we have seen all different composition. We have seen polypropylene, we have seen PVC, we have seen polyethylene, nylon, Kevlar, acrylic, and all different types of microplastics in the samples that we have collected from the Delaware River. Okay. And later on, we thought like although we did not do a backtracking of source, but we looked at like if there were any manufacturing facilities or clothing facilities or packaging facilities nearby all these samples, and actually we detected huge amounts of polyethylene, polypropylene near Frankfurt and Neshaminy Creek, and they were closer to the packaging manufacturing firms along this Delaware River. Although, we have, I mean, we do not know if there was any leaching or release of materials from them. We do not know, but there were some industries, manufacturing industries, packaging industries along the Delaware River sites that we have collected our samples from. And based on all the data that we have collected, the Delaware River Basin Commission, they actually developed a three-dimensional model. So imagine if somebody is releasing microplastics or anything into the river, we want to understand how they will distribute. So they came up with a hydrodynamic model, which looked at the flows of the river and length, width, everything, the flow, and uh, the conditions. So they had some of the data that the flow data from their flow gauges that they have in the river, and they use that data to model or simulate how the microplastics can transport. So for doing that, what they did is mostly microplastics, they typically do not react or react with any water. So they said like we will do something like a conservative dye study. So essentially, if you release a dye, you can imagine taking a glass of water, put a color or food dye or something, it spreads. So they kind of use that type of modeling, and they looked at what was happening to these dyes. So they essentially came up with these graphs where it shows like how the distribution can happen. So based on all the uh, flow models, low flow, high flow, we can say that, these microplastics can predominantly stay in the upper layers of the water for up to 20 days and then start moving from one bank to the other bank and moving down into the river. So there is a lot that goes on into modeling. This is just showing modeling one location, Frankfurt Creek location. We do have similar models for all different sampling sites that we did, and it kind of like shows us the how the flow can uh, you know transport these microplastics along the river when it's flowing. So not only that, what DRBC staff and some volunteers did, they went along uh, went along these sites, and they conducted some cleanup studies. So there was some community education, as well as there were like a lot of volunteers who went along. Uh, and the locations where we were seeing like higher plastic pollution near Tukani, Takoni, and Frankfurt creeks, they went along those creeks and started collecting plastic trash. And as we can expect, they actually collected almost 20 bags of plastic trash. And this plastic would enter into the waterways, and depending on uh, the flow conditions, depending on what it's exposed to, depending on the sunlight, the weathering, they will turn into these tiny, tiny microplastics, which are, nowadays abundant in some of these rivers. And they could be causing harm. And they could be not only causing harm, they might have some human health impacts and things like that. Okay. And so, based on our study, microplastics were pretty much prevalent in all the locations. And as you have seen, fibers and fragments were pretty much predominant in all of our samples, almost all different colors, indicating these could be coming from clothing or any other plastic material that we use. And we identified almost 15 different types of plastics, mostly polyester, rayon, and polyethylene, but there were another 12 different types which were on the lower side. And so apart from Delaware River being a home to diverse aquatic species, looks like it's also uh, home to diverse classes of microplastics. And these microplastics, you know, there is a possibility that this plastic material can be interacting with any other types of emerging contaminants, for example, antibiotics or PFAS, which are like forever chemicals, and they could be transporting these materials. Based on our study, we do conclude that there are further studies that we need to conduct to understand like if they are really transporting any of these. And not only that, there are multiple challenges that need to be addressed, like in terms of sampling and how accurate the analysis is, and if these microplastics are contributing to any type of like antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance, because they could be carrying some antibiotics with them. And as far as human health impacts, there could be some human health impacts, but it is not yet fully understood. So that is something that still remains an open question. And all of this study has been published in Environmental Engineering Science Journal. I have the title right down there. And I would like to acknowledge all the students that participated in this study. The sample collection was a challenging thing, as well as sample analysis, because we had to filter those samples, look at each and every particle that we collected on those filters, and manually pick those using like tiny, tiny uh, pair of tongs, and putting them under microscopes and taking them for a chemical analysis. It was a very cumbersome job. And I would also like to acknowledge Delaware River Basin Commission for funding this project and also helping us doing some of the data analysis. And with that, I would like to thank you guys, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andaluri. Really fascinating presentation, and thank you, Catherine, as well. I like the sequence of these two presentations following each other because they paint a really good picture. And just as a reminder, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Eisenberg, the state co-lead for the Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Work Group. What I thought was really nice about how these two presentations complemented each other is Catherine talking at the beginning about, first fact, the predominant textile that's out there is polyester. And then to hear that that's something that's really common showing up in the water and that microfibers are the most prevalent type of microplastic is really an interesting kind of context for our discussion this afternoon. So I'm going to ask both of our speakers if there's anything that they heard in the other presenters' talk that they would like to follow up on, something that was interesting or that they'd like to amplify to kind of make a point. And while you're thinking about that, maybe another question for you also is, based on the work that you did, that you just presented on, are there any questions that you're kind of itching to get to next that it opened up? You talked about that a little bit there at the end, Dr. Andaluri, but anything that, now that you've done this work, what's your next step? So I invite you to answer any of those questions.
Yeah, I can go first. Actually, when I was looking at Catherine's presentation, where you presented water coming from wastewater going into municipal facilities, and from there, essentially your effluents end up in rivers, right? And they could be carrier of these microplastics. Actually, I did not present here, but before this study, we did a small study on one of the wastewater treatment plants where we actually saw these microplastics and fibers being present in the effluents. And I think it's very interesting, and it is very relevant to understand, like, can we remove those microfibers and microplastics from entering at the first point, like from the wastewater going into the rivers? Uh, that could be a source, because other than that, the what I see is other sources could be like stormwater outfalls or drains and things like that. But wastewater treatment plants could be a source, and that could be something where some of the work can be focused on, whether we can have some type of filters, as you mentioned, to remove those microfibers from even entering the streams. So that was, actually, I didn't see your presentation before, but it's really fascinating to see that, because, in our study, we were seeing so much of microfibers and, polyester material, and we wanted to see whether, there was any correlation, and it really makes sense how these things can get transported. And to me, the next burning question would be like whether these microplastics are transporting any chemicals, as I mentioned. There are, I have, our research group, we have done a lot of work in looking at different types of contaminants like antibiotics and parent polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are like forever chemicals. And there is presence of those chemicals in both Schuylkill as well as the Delaware rivers. And there are some reports showing like when the microplastics and other contaminants are present in river water, there is a possible interaction based on the type of river water. So are these transporting any of those contaminants along the way? And with can there be anything done to understand those interactions, like how they happen, why they happen, and would that be a pathway where I have seen in the past, I think Delaware River Basin folks have conducted some studies looking at presence of these emerging contaminants in fish. So they are constantly exposed to microplastics because they are there. Are these any carriers to that? I think there are some of those unanswered questions,
Yeah.
like how they're carrying other contaminants.
Interesting. Well, please do keep us posted as you continue into those questions. And Catherine, any reflections from you before we jump into Q&A?
Just thinking from a solutions perspective, I'm not an engineer. I think a lot though about how we can filter for something like PFAS, which is the forever chemical that's been mentioned, simultaneously filtering for microplastics because they're both these emerging contaminants. We're talking about them a lot. How do we combine efforts? And to Dr. Andaluri's point, microplastics could act as a surface that transports these materials into the body. But I'm happy to do questions from the audience.
Great. Yeah, I know. I'm pretty sure there's a very willing audience with lots of questions. We'll start because I see a hand up, but then Joe, if you don't mind bringing some of the questions in from the chat after we go to Sanjay. And so Sanjay, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, so just following up with Dr. Andaluri, thank you again, both great presentation. It is an emerging contaminant. So what I'm looking for is is an effort been made to classify whether it's a fiber, in further classifying the fiber into the plastics or the clothing material on that number one. Second is the seasonal sampling attempt has been made because whether it has make any changes or not. That's number two. And for Catherine, I know the research is underway for the filtration and anything. Is there any other, like in your research, have you come across any other state where they have implemented or there is a successful filtration method that has been at least a prototype level or employed anywhere in the states or any other local facility where, and what is the outcome, how it's working? So I know I threw multiple questions out here.
No problem. Thank you, Sanjay. Very interesting questions. Unfortunately, for our study, we did not do seasonal variation, and I do expect there would be a lot of seasonal variation because we have done analysis of other contaminants. But during this study, it was peak COVID, and we did this study under a lot of restrictions. Getting into the lab was a very difficult situation in that 2020 time frame when we did the analysis. So unfortunately, we couldn't do seasonal analysis. But that would have been really interesting to understand, how some of the parameters can affect their distribution in our samples. And to your other question about fibers and classifying them, I think it will be pretty interesting. At the time we did the study, we were using a Fourier transform FTIR instrument, and we were manually picking those fibers and placing them on the FTIR to understand their composition. But I think nowadays there are much fancier instruments like LDIR, laser-based diffraction infrared spectroscopy, where you can take the sample and put them directly. And I think that might be an easier way to understand and look at, because that instrument actually gives a spectrum for each and every particle that's in that sample. But when we did not have access to those instruments. So unfortunately, we were not able to do it, but it would have been a really good addition to this project that we did to do seasonal impacts as well as understanding all these fibers. And not only that, we do not know which material is degrading at what rate. That again could be something that we need to address.
So answering your last set of questions about like the state of filtration, just as an example, in 2023, there was a piece of vetoed legislation in California that was set to mandate, I think the language in the bill was washing machines sold by 2030 in California need to include a filtration for microfibers. But that was vetoed, and part of the justification was that there just isn't, the filtration technology isn't there yet. There's issues with efficacy. So there are existing filters. There's one from, I think it's called Vitrol. There's one from Planet Care. I could send you a resource that lists some of these different filters and the efficacies. Some of the issues are concerns with like flooding. If a consumer isn't changing the filter, could that lead to like a flooding issue? There's concerns about the filter itself being made of plastic. Will that break down? There's concerns about cost. And then I think part of the issue is like just they're not 100%, like there's still microfibers passing through. That's part of the reason why the researchers I'm working with have this opportunity to try to refine the technology. And then there's also, what do you do with those fibers? Let's say you're a consumer and you clean out your filter. What, like, maybe I'll just pour it under the sink because that's a great way to clean a filter. Well, it's just going to go back into the water. So there isn't this great solution yet for what to do with that filtered fiber. I mean, throwing it in the garbage, that'll send it to a landfill, but we could, it's all, we're never going to be a perfect solution. So trying
Yeah.
to come up with a better solution. Does that answer your question?
That answers, I think, this things filters I knew. It's just only thing like I don't know whether it's a large scale application has been done because I think the wastewater treatment plant becomes a major source as they collect all the sewers and everything. So it becomes a major source, not just from the uh, household sewers. It's also take the leachate from the landfills. It also takes runoff from the recycling center. So it's a kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different uh, polluted material, polluted liquid that comes with it. You take the tire chips from the road, and that comes into the stormwater and runs into the stormwater and comes into it. That's another source of the microplastics right there. So, if any large scale study, and if it is on small scale study, I know it results into the major issue becomes what to do after it because we do not want to go into that circular chain where endless loop this microplastic continues to roaming around in the environment. So yes, we're trying to break that chain. And is there any application that has been made any other state, anywhere else that you kind of have come across as we're thinking into this direction?
I know in New Jersey there was a pilot in Atlantic City for a wastewater treatment filtration system, but these are all small. I think you're asking
Okay.
about large scale studies. I'm not aware.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
And Catherine, that conversation about what to do with the filter, my wife and I were just having that conversation about the lint filter on the dryer of, what's the best way to get it out of there so it's not going all around the room. Definitely no perfect answers. Joe, I know you're curating questions, some that were submitted ahead of time and some from the chat, so I'll let you take a lead on the first question.
Thanks. Yeah, there are questions both submitted beforehand and in the chat. So I'm going to start with beforehand and then go into ones in the chat. So first up, we know that local communities and stakeholders are vital to the success of environmental programs. In your experience, how can we better engage local communities in decision-making around microfiber pollution, particularly when it comes to policy development and implementation?
So your questions about how to engage local communities in policymaking in
Yes.
particular?
Yeah.
I'll just take a stab at this. I think at this stage, we're in like awareness building stage. Just trying to get this pollution issue elevated so that people are aware of it. And then, I mean, California is way ahead of this issue. They have a microplastic strategy that includes microfibers. We can look to kind of what's happening in California, also what's happening in Europe. In France, there's already been legislation passed that mandates filtration to be installed in washing machines within the next couple of years. Let me think a little bit more about how to engage folks on this. I'm a non-advocate, so I have to think about it, but I'll point that out that there are geographies that are ahead of our mid-Atlantic region, and particularly California and France.
Based on actually, I'm also not the policy into the policy, but based on my experience, I had a couple of students work with me in the lab, and students, I mean high school students, and they were not aware of this issue at all, like the microplastic pollution. And they were aware of like, okay, there are some environmental contaminants and things like that. So I would say like maybe to get this community engagement, maybe schools would be something where you start and educating. And at Temple, I am also faculty advisor for one of the clubs here, which is Society of Environmental Engineers and Scientists, and students from the club actually went around campus and with the community, actually they collected all these plastic debris that was discarded, alongside sidewalks and all these stormwater drains, so, and they collected like almost 20, 30 bags of plastic waste just across around Temple's campus. So I think community engagement can be done in terms of like getting this out to schools, or if you have some of these societies and clubs that are volunteering and talking about those. I know DRBC did that community engagement where they went and looked around those creeks where they were finding all this plastic waste, and people were interested in knowing more about that. So,
Yeah, and I think teenagers and younger folks can be really, in my experience, can get really plugged into this issue because they're consumers. I mean, everyone is buying clothing. A lot of quote unquote fast fashion is marketed towards younger people, and there is this kind of rising awareness of sustainability issues within clothing. So just anecdotally, whenever I've kind of worked with teenagers or younger folks in this, I've seen that interest of like, oh, this is something that I'm a part of. I can relate to this.
Yeah, thank you. This next question combines two of them that were asked. So, what do you think the next steps are in microfiber research? And is there a certain method that is followed, like a paper or study, that is heavily influential in the field? Mostly for methodology.
If we are talking about analysis methodologies, yes, there are a ton of papers that talk about all different types of analyses, but there's not any particular one. I think as of now, you know, still it is something that people are looking for analysis methods because if you have to report the microplastics or microfibers in terms of concentration, and imagine if you're sampling at one point of the day and you collect like X number of particles and you report that as like X particles per 100 liters of sample, that may not be true, so people are still trying to figure out a quantitative way of describing things. I think not only that, even the composition and all of these, there's still people looking for, understanding, studying, and standardizing these methods for water as well as wastewater, because in wastewater is first of all it's a very complex matrix, and some of these microplastics can be stuck in them, and you may not be even analyzing them. So people are looking for alternate ways to. Some people are looking for like maybe total organic carbon or some other ways of uh, trying a correlation, but still, I don't think there's like a very standard method.
And if I could just jump in on that, is part of the reason that there isn't a standard method because of the limitations on the size classes that certain methods can look at, or is it more complex than that?
I would say it's more complex than that.
Okay.
It's like, and because I have known people who have collected 10,000 liters for analysis. We did graph sampling at 10 liters and net sampling for like 4 hours, which was close to like 5,000 liters of flow. So uh, it can get pretty complex.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And
Regarding, go ahead.
Dr. Andaluri, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the issue is just the variety of methods that are like if you're trying to come up with a standardized method for sampling microplastics, we're part of the issue is that's not yet established. Is that correct?
Yes, it's not established. If it is something like a dissolved chemical, it's easier, but this is something that's not a dissolved chemical. It's a particle that's floating or settled at the bottom or something. So uh, that that's correct.
And Catherine, I saw you answering some questions in the chat, so thank you for that. But I'm going to follow up with one of them. How do the microfibers align with actual composition of fabrics? Are some materials more likely to shed than others? The second part. So I'll start with that. Are some materials more likely to shed than others?
Yeah, I put this comment in the chat. Fleece, right? If you look at fleece under a microscope, or if you look at the actual weave pattern, part of the reason fleece is so warm is it has these really open loops that trap and capture air. And these loops are really fragile and easy to break. You might know this if you have like a fleece sweater and you ever use a lint roller. That's just one example of how the actual composition or the weave pattern of the material can influence how easily the material breaks off. You might have also, there's actually low shed materials. You might notice they're really slick, like there's certain types of polyester. I could try to find some photos. There are materials that shed less than others. That's a very basic answer though. Dr. Andaluri, do you have anything to add?
I would just add like it depends on the type of material and exposure to weathering events like exposure to sunlight, exposure to you know any types of wear and tear. I would add that, but I, yeah, that's all.
Thank you. And does rayon break down as it is a naturally derived material versus polyester, for example?
A good
Uh,
question. Because it's
yeah,
cellulose, right?
it's cellulose. It can break down. We have seen rayon in our sampling events.
I want to, I just adding the dimension of it's not just the fiber, but there's also, and Dr. Andaluri, you might be better off speaking to the additives, right? Like dyes that are applied to it, various like anti-wrinkle chemical or various things that are added for like sheen. I always wonder if a rayon fiber breaks down, but then it's coated in materials that don't readily break down, kind of what that process actually is in the environment. And then you brought in the part of like what happens when the sun gets exposed to these chemicals that changes the reactions.
Yeah, rayon is typically biodegradable, but as you mentioned, if it's a cellulose material, so it should be like more biodegradable stuff. But then it would take time, and then adding dyes to it. Dyes are toxic chemicals, so those can change the entire landscape of things. Uh, but that is something I have not looked into, uh, like how these breakdowns are happening or what's contributing.
Yes, that could definitely be an area of active research.
Yeah.
Here's a good one. What is the connection between microplastics and climate change mitigation work?
Well, if there are microplastics, and if you're talking about from what I have read, these microplastics travel. So the plastic particles, when they travel, they can alter the freeze points of ice and water. So at minus below 32 degrees, water should convert to ice. So that freeze point can be altered. So if there is like a lot of plastic that's traveling to up to zones, it could be melting that ice because now it's uh, the freeze point has changed, similar to like if you add salt and if you try to freeze that, microplastics have a similar effect where they can change the properties depending on temperature. So
Yeah, and my reaction to that question is more of like a life cycle analysis. What are the fossil fuels that are used to produce a polyester shirt versus a cotton shirt? What is the water consumption? It can get so, you can really get in the weeds of what is sustainable. You know, if there is a push against cotton because cotton is a huge water consumer to grow it, and then there's like human labor issues with how it's cultivated. This is maybe a little weird way to get to climate change, but it's all very interconnected. Is like what is the fossil fuel production in making these materials? That it's not specific to microfibers. It's more just the fashion industry in general. Where are our clothes made? How do they get here? These are the kinds of questions that are raising to my head when I think about climate change and microfibers.
Yeah, thank you for that. We just have a few
If
more
I
minutes left. So
Joe, if I could just jump in on that question, a question for Dr. Andaluri. I've heard in some presentation somewhere else that after a lot of big storm damage, folks were finding small blue fibers that they thought suspected were coming from tarps in their in their water samples. Is that something that you were seeing in there as well? And of course, again, the somewhat direct, indirect climate connection there being that, as storm damage increases, perhaps the use of tarps will increase. And, any thoughts on that?
That could be true. We have seen blue-colored microplastics, and we are not able to answer the question on what type of plastic is causing these.
Gotcha.
And and those fibers that we saw, colored fibers, it could be, coming from clothing or these materials. And also, not only that, I think we did see some of these fishing when they use those, uh, tiny the plastic fishing nets, and it could be coming from anywhere. Yes.
Gotcha. I appreciate it.
well, I was just saying we have a few more minutes left. We're almost out of time. So I was going to pass it over to you, Will, for some final comments and to wrap it up.
Yeah. I most of all just want to thank our two speakers today for some really, really good perspective on this topic of microfibers. Also, thanks to Joe for organizing this webinar today and the entire webinar series. My kind of takeaways from this are that fibers are in our environment. That is a truth. That's something that Dr. Andaluri showed very well. And that polyesters are very prevalent. Therefore, kind of suggesting that tie to more fabric and textile sources. But the stuff that Catherine was talking about in the beginning was also really interesting to me in the idea that, as she put it later in the conversation, we're in the awareness building phase. Maybe places like France and California are some models to look towards as we try and build awareness on this. But just as a quick, interesting anecdote, Marco and the Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Work Group did a public survey of support for plastic policy issues. And one interesting thing as you got on microplastics was the level of support for testing in water was really high. It was 80%. Then when you get down to having filtration on your laundry, it dropped down to 70%. And then when you get to having label requirements for textiles, it dropped down to 60%. And the only thing that really changed in there was the level of uncertainty that people had was, well, I don't really know about this. So the big takeaway there from that and from what Catherine was talking about is that that's really kind of our onus right now is to help people understand this. And the challenges that she showed also is it's really hard to do that when people can't see it, but perhaps there's ways in where you talk about their interests and their convenience. You want to keep your clothes lasting long and looking good for a long time. So definitely a lot to learn there, definitely a lot to do there, but just a lot of thanks to our two presenters for a really, really good look into this world of microfibers. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon. And keep an eye out. One more thing. This webinar is recorded and will be on the Marco website. It'll be on, you can go to midatlanticocean.org, and you can find it there by going to the news section, finding this webinar series. And keep an eye out also there for our other three webinars in this series coming up starting in March and then following up until September, August time. So thank you all so much, and see you on the next one, if not before.
Thank you, Will. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You as well. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.